Center Grace family. It is Wednesday again, and with that, it means another weekly devotional. So we've been talking about some of these comparison clauses, these moments where Jesus will talk about how just as the Father loves him, so it is that he loved us. So we're going to look at another comparison clause today in the Gospel of John again, John chapter 17. But before we dive into that, let me tell you a quick story. So back in 2000, Brooke and I were able to go on a mission trip and spend some time in Indonesia. And I'll never forget the feeling when we stepped off the boat for the first time in Indonesia. We were constantly being looked at. We were a team of other folks, and we were constantly being looked at by the people who lived there. And the look on their faces was kind of we know you're not from around here and you're not welcome. I've never had that feeling as acutely as we did when we were on this small island in Indonesia. And that feeling kind of made me want to do one of two things. On the one hand, it made me desire more than anything else to just be able to blend in. Almost like, I would be like one of the natives in one sense, just so I wouldn't stand out as much. The other thing that it kind of pushed me to on the opposite end or the opposite extreme was this idea of, oh gosh, I just wish we could all get to our hotel and be able to huddle and kind of insulate from all of this. And I think that oftentimes when we go through life, there's that temptation to move to one of those extremes, especially as Christians. So there's always a temptation to go native. That is to just live like the rest of culture around us. But then on the other hand, there's also an equally strong temptation to at times just insulate and pull away from culture, the larger culture, and these relationships with people who maybe don't know Jesus, and just kind of huddle up with other Christians. And I think we deal with that temptation constantly. And the passage we're going to look at today speaks about that. It actually speaks against both of those extremes, but Jesus has some really interesting words. This is in Jesus's prayer for us in John 17:14 through verse 18. Listen to what Jesus is praying. He says, "I have given my disciples your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you will take them out of the world, but that you will keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world." So you actually hear a couple of different comparison clauses there. And remember, we've talked about how these comparisons, on the one hand, are encouraging, but then on the other hand, are challenging. They encourage us with the truth, but then on the other hand, they challenge us to do something in life. And so in John 17:14 to 18, Jesus says, he gives two comparison clauses. He says, just as I am not of the world, so they are not of the world. He says that twice. But then he says, but Father, just as you sent me into the world, so I send them into the world. Now, we already talked in one sense about that second comparison clause. That was where we started a few weeks ago. Jesus said that again in John 21. He said, just as the Father sent me, so it is that I send you. Here, Jesus is praying that for his disciples. And we'll talk about that again. But the one that I really want to focus on just a little bit today is this idea of how just as Jesus is not of the world, so we're not of the world. Now, the question that we have to wrestle with when we first come to that comparison clause is, what in the world is the world? Well, let's first talk about what the world here is not. So the word world, biblically, can, on the one hand, mean God's good creation, the physical world that he created. That's not what Jesus means. Genesis 1 is very clear that when God made the world, he made it very good. And when Jesus is praying here about the world, he means something totally different. He doesn't mean just the physical realm. He means something a little bit more deep than that, and a little bit more twisted, if you can actually say it that way. So David Wells, a theologian at the seminary, once described the world this way. He said, the world is a value system and set of behaviors that makes sin look normal and righteousness look strange. That's what the world is. It's a value system and set of behaviors that makes sin normal and righteousness, or the way of God, strange. That's what the world is. Jesus says, I'm not of the world. I'm actually more set according to your pattern, God, your way. I'm set completely on your righteousness, God. And I'm praying that my disciples would also recognize the fact that they are not of the world. They have been called to a new way, a new pattern, a new set of standards, your righteousness, your way. So again, the world is a value system or set of behaviors that make sin seem normal and God's righteousness seem strange. Or another way that somebody described the world, one of my professors at the seminary, Richard Lovelace, also called the world corporate human fallenness. So we sin individually. That's what the Bible oftentimes calls, like if you read the NIV, you might see the word sinful nature, or the ESV, the flesh. That's what just individual personal fallenness is. It's our predisposition, our desires that are leaning away from God and towards rebellion. But the world is corporate human fallenness. It's a corporate desire away from God. Again, it's something that makes sin seem normal and righteousness seem strange. This is the idea of how human institutions and human systems, if you will, can in fact be built on values that are against God, that make sin seem normal and God's righteousness seem strange. So value systems and institutions and things like that set away from God's purposes, set on selfishness, set on idolatry, set on sin. And we deal with those things all the time. So first and foremost, we have to get clear, what does Jesus mean when he says the word world? He's talking about this idea of value systems and behaviors that are making sin seem normal and God's righteousness seem strange. And we are not of the world. That's what Jesus says here. We are not of the world. Jesus just says that abundantly clearly. Just as I'm not of the world, so my disciples aren't of the world. In John 3, Jesus, in that conversation with Nicodemus, had talked about the idea of being born again. Remember that? And in essence, what Jesus tells Nicodemus, the kingdom of God has to be born into us. It's something that God does by his Spirit. Another way that the Bible talks about that is the idea of us getting new hearts. So we have a new set of desires. You begin seeing that, again, our value system is reshaped around God's righteousness. God's righteousness no longer seems strange anymore. It seems good. It's actually sin that seems like what we want to avoid. So again, we can't go native, and yet on the other hand, we don't want to insulate from the world. But what Jesus prays here too is that God would sanctify us. Verse 17, he says, I want you to sanctify my disciples in your truth. Your word is truth. And so again, Jesus is praying for this ongoing process of renewal. What it means that we're not of the world is that there's an ongoing process that God has begun in us through his Spirit and through the gospel, through the word, through his truth, that transforms us. And so if you remember, our first characteristic of a disciple is a person who experiences renewal, personal renewal through the gospel. That's why we're not of the world. But here's what Jesus also says. We are sent to the world. Remember, there's a second comparison clause here. So just as I'm not of the world, neither are they of the world. I want you to sanctify them. Keep that ongoing work of renewal going in them, God. But just as you have sent me into the world, so I want to send them. So we can't go native on the one hand, nor can we insulate and just isolate ourselves from the surrounding world. Neither extreme is God's desire or his intention for us. So we have to live as faithfully present witnesses on behalf of Jesus. You think about like our sermon series last summer through Daniel. Think about the prophets and how they lived faithfully present in the world, but not of the world, as Jesus says elsewhere. And so what can you do in response to this comparison clause? What is the encouragement and what is the challenge? Well, the encouragement is that you have been given a new heart. You've been given a new set of desires. sin no longer seems normal to you. Righteousness seems normal. It seems good. And so when you sin, you want to be quick to repent, quick to actually ask for God's and other people's forgiveness. So something else that you can do is you can pray for God's transforming work to continue in your life. You can pray for God's transforming work to begin in the lives of others. That's one thing you can do in light of these comparison clauses. But then the second one, and this oftentimes is much harder for us as Christians, because again, we're always in danger of those two extremes of either going native or isolating. The other thing that we can do is begin asking God, who do you want me to be faithfully present to? Who are you sending me to in the world? And you can know that. You can know the answer to that question by beginning to observe, who is it that God has put in my life that is near to me but far from God, that is beginning to lean into relationship in a more deep way. Maybe it's your neighbor, maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's a family member that doesn't know Jesus, but they're leaning into you, into relationship in a way that maybe they haven't before, or maybe that you weren't expecting. And God may be wanting you to, again, be the person who's faithfully present in their lives. But God has, though we are not of the world, he sends us to the world, just like he did his son. And church, that is one of the other things that this comparison clause both encourages us towards and challenges us in. We love you guys, and we'll see you on Sunday.